Thank you for the opportunity to give a seminar again on this platform. It's a privilege. And thank you everyone for joining. It's good to see some people I know, some I do not know. But thank you for joining the seminar this evening. So this evening I'm going to be talking about above ground biomass. So how forests sequester carbon. To make it simple for someone that doesn't know what above ground biomass does. So I'll be looking at, or we'll be looking at how demographic processes contribute to above ground biomass in an African montane forest. We're in an era where there's so much talk about carbon and how forests are important for carbon storage and carbon sequestration. And there is so much, COP30 has just concluded in Brazil. And part of what would have been discussed there would be about carbon, about protecting our forest or protecting our ecosystems to ensure that we can regulate our climate. And so a lot of people talk about carbon and carbon sequestration, and there is so much information that is shared out there. Some scientists will say that they are false. And how much do our forests actually contribute to carbon sequestration? Our forests, the most important sinks for carbon, or do we have forests that are not even sinks for carbon but are sources for carbon? So there is so much information and there is so much research going on carbon sequestration and how the biomass of trees and present biomass in the soil contributes to how much carbon can be stored in an ecosystem and how much is given off based on disturbances that occur within that ecosystem. So my area of research is in mountain forest, so what we call montane forest. So I specialize in African montane forest and I work in Ingelnyaki. I'm currently in Ingelnyaki, by the way. So I will be taking you through some work that we've been doing from the past, say, 10 years. And basically, we're looking at how this particular forest changes over time as a result of either stochastic events or other factors that are present within the environment that are contributing to the structure and the functioning of this forest. So for this work, I'm working with David Kenfak and Hazel Chapman, and it's a paper that we are working on, and hopefully we should have it out by next year. So I thought to share some of the insights we have from this research with you all. Okay. So forests. Forests are important ecosystems. We know that they contribute so much to the carbon cycling. So forests make up 35% of Earth's land. They store quite a huge amount of carbon, almost 861 billion metric tons. Most of it is found in biomass. The biomass, 9% is found in dead wood, and the lot of it is found in soil. So it is reported that forests are able to sequester, that is store carbon, up to 120 billion metric tons a year. And by estimation, the models that have been out there that has been shared is saying that when forests are properly managed, it could store or it could sequester up to 20% of carbon that is emitted around the globe. Now, when you think of forests, sometimes there are different types of forests. So you have primary forests, you have what we call secondary forests. So there are forests that they are not tampered. We have something that is close to pristine forest, so very little disturbance. But most of the forests we have around the world are encountering at least some form of anthropogenic disturbances. And when we talk about carbon sequestration, you may think that forest, if you have a particular plantation, for instance, so you have plantations that are established around, and a lot of times you think, oh, okay, one tree is the same as the other, but no, it is not. So because we find that carbon sequestration, so carbon and biodiversity are linked. Okay, so what we have seen is that a more biodiverse ecosystem is able to sequester more carbon than a less diverse ecosystem. And that is why when we talk about tropical forests being very significant ecosystems in the world in terms of carbon sequestration, it is linked to how diverse this ecosystem is. So tropical forests are just 10% of the Earth's land surface. However, it's reasoned to be the most essential ecosystem, terrestrial ecosystem, especially for carbon storage. So in terms of biodiversity conservation, these tropical forests have over 60% of the world's plant and animal species. So it is highly diverse. That's where most of the diversity is found. In terms of global carbon cycling, terrestrial net primary production, these forests are responsible for it. So all of that carbon, most of the carbon in the atmosphere, in terrestrial ecosystems, these tropical forests are the forests that store most of that carbon. Therefore, they contribute to regulate our climate. And that's why there is so much emphasis on preserving our tropical forests, whether it's in the Amazon or in the Congo. It's a very important ecosystem that needs to be preserved, especially considering that it is such a small ecosystem. So, like I said, tropical forests are important for the global carbon cycling. So you find that for tropical forests, they account for 1/3 of terrestrial gross primary production. So if we think of how energy moves through the ecosystem, we have our primary producers, and most of the energy that is produced by these primary producers is from this ecosystem, tropical forest. So 1/3 of terrestrial GPP is produced by tropical forests, and therefore they are very significant. So they hold up to 200 tons of carbon per hectare, and they are but then I think one of the things to note is that only structurally intact tropical forests are increasing in carbon stocks. And that's why you hear sometimes on the news, you would hear things like the Amazon is no longer a carbon sink, but it's a carbon source. And that's because of the so much degradation that is happening within the forest. So the idea that forests just keep taking in carbon it's a bit tricky because that's not how it happens. Because as plants produce and take in carbon and produce O2, that's oxygen, and biomass, they also use some of that energy they produce for respiration. So there is some respiration happening. And then if there is destruction and degradation also happening within that ecosystem, that is also bringing out the CO2. So you find that a forest can, if it is not intact, if it is being degraded, it may no longer be a carbon sink. It would rather be a carbon source. And that's why you'd hear things like how the Amazon is now contributing to carbon emissions in the world. So when we think of these ecosystems, we think of the changes that happen within them. So changes in tree growth, changes in mortality, and if tree growth or if tree mortality, depending on which one's higher, it can either serve as a buffer or it can exacerbate the CO2 that we have in the atmosphere. So either your forest is sequestering carbon or more than it is giving off, or it is giving off more carbon than more than it is sequestering. And you look at the net carbon sequestration in the negative, it's no longer serving as a store for carbon or a sink for carbon, but as a source for carbon. So that is why it is very important that forests are kept intact. That is why there is all of that push by scientists and conservationists that we should protect our forests, we should maintain their integrity, and we should reduce activities that would cause more problem for our environment and for the climate. So I did mention these carbon stocks in an ecosystem. They can change, and so there are several drivers. They could be biotic drivers and they could be abiotic drivers, but primarily, and what I'm focusing on for this talk is how the demographic processes, so processes of growth, recruitment, and mortality, how they drive tree biomass and carbon stocks. So if just to give you a simple explanation of what these three demographic processes do, is that with growth, there would be increase in biomass. Recruitment introduces new individuals in the population, therefore it increases biomass, while mortality reduces biomass and consequently reduces carbon stocks within an ecosystem. So these are the processes that determine whether a forest would function as a carbon sink or a carbon source. So when trees are cut down, when there is fire, biomass is reducing within an ecosystem, and therefore that ecosystem is acting more like a source than a sink for CO2. Okay, so now there's been so much research that has been done on tropical forests. However, like with most studies focus on, you hear on the Amazon, you hear Borneo. So a lot of studies focus on the neotropics and the Asian tropics. Africa's tropical forests, it's only more recently that you have studies that look at their carbon storage capacities. But the studies that have been done have shown that these forests are as important as your Amazon or as your Borneo in storing carbon. But then, like I said, these forests are the least studied in the tropics. So we have a lot of uncertainties in global carbon models. We're not sure of what these forests are doing and what factors are contributing to how they are behaving in terms of carbon storage. And when you even consider Africa's tropical forests, montane forests are even less studied. Many studies focus on the forests in the Congo, forests that go into Cameroon and places like Gabon. And you'd find that montane forests, yes, once in a while you'd find some studies, but there's a lack of data that is particularly noticeable for forest systems. So these montane forests, or Afro-montane forests, like we call them, they make up only 8% of Africa's forest cover. So it's not a large area. If you see the map on the right side of my screen, it shows where the positions of these forests are. What you have on the south, usually they are excluded because they are more temperate-like than tropical. But then these are where you have montane forests, or what we call more Afro-montane forest. So these are forests that are generally above 1,500 meters in elevation. They do not have as many species as your lowland tropical forests. So they are not like your typical rainforest with many different species, but they are a refugia for endemic species. So you would have, for instance, if you go to East Africa, there is the species of Podocarpus that is endemic to just Afro-montane regions, can be found there. However, even though they are species poor compared to lowland tropical forests, they store a substantial amount of carbon. And this has been shown in a recent study that was done in 2021, where data was collected for these Afro-montane forests, for data that was available for different plots of Afro-montane forest. And the authors showed that these forests store a substantial amount of carbon that is comparable to lowland tropical forests and in other parts of the world, and even the one in Africa. Now, montane forest ecosystems are highly susceptible to anthropogenic disturbances. I think between the year 2023 to 2027, the UN has been paying particular attention to mountain areas, both people, ecosystems, and this is because you find that a lot of people live around these mountain areas, and so these ecosystems are very susceptible to anthropogenic disturbances. Therefore, there is a certain urgency for us to better understand how they function ecologically, and also to understand how they store carbon, especially, like I said, that disturbances can make ecosystems become a carbon source rather than being a carbon sink. So just to show you that Afro-montane forest, or montane forest, also called fog forest, cloud forest, and that's because for most part of the year, you would always see the presence of cloud and fog, which is a very important feature for these ecosystems. So like I said, this was a study that was published in 2021 that showed that these African montane forests are able to store high carbon in their above ground biomass. And this study went out to and showed that even the past records of what these forests were able to store, it was 2/3 more than that. So past records had shown that these forests were able to store only about 89 megagrams of carbon. However, from this study, it showed that on average, these forests can store 149.4 megagrams of carbon. And like I said, from this study, it showed that the rates of that these montane forests are able to store carbon is comparable to lowland and other montane forests across the world, as you can see from this figure that is shown here. Okay, so from this study, because this was carried out using data from different areas, different plots in different countries, and this is a large amount of data, and it was used to show that you can even see that in the forest you have, the montane forest in Africa store more carbon, or have more above ground carbon stocks compared to areas in the neotropics. So if this green here for the neotropics would be where you have the Amazon. So you can see that the value here seems to even look higher than what you have for the neotropics. So these forests are quite important for carbon storage. So why is this? Why is research on carbon sequestration? Why is it important for us to pay attention to these kinds of studies? Um, I think it's common knowledge for most of us now that our forests are changing. So we have these changing forests. There are high human activities. So even though some parts of forest look like they are unchanged, but there are a lot of activities happening within ecosystems, not just forest. I'm emphasizing forest because that's where I work in. But almost all ecosystems are facing some form of degradation, and there are escalating anthropogenic pressures. And this is altering the biotic and the abiotic environment. It's tampering with interactions such that even where you kind of find relatively intact forests, you're now having what we call empty forests. Forests that are devoid of interactions. There are no longer animals doing what they're supposed to do. And so the trajectory of many forest ecosystems is not looking good at all, because we do not know what these forests are going to look like in the future. And with modeling and a lot of scientific research into what is likely to happen, if things do not change, then the future looks a bit bleak. So I think the question for us to ask is, what is the future of carbon storage for these forests, these Afro-montane forests, or forests in general? What is the future for carbon storage? Is it like scientists are predicting that if things continue to be as they are, then we're going to end up with more forest sources than sinks? Or are we going to be able to create strategies to maintain intact forests? Or what is going to be next? What can we do for these forests so that they are able to continue to do what they are supposed to do? So for the study that we're doing, the aim of the study, we aim to quantify tree-level above-ground biomass in a montane forest and to investigate how demographic processes drive variation in species-level contribution to carbon dynamics. So we're looking at how growth, recruitment, and mortality drive variation in different species, contributions to the carbon dynamics of this montane forest ecosystem. And our specific objectives were to examine the role of these demographic processes in determining the net above ground biomass in the forest, and then to also evaluate how functional traits influence demographic performance, and by so doing also how it affects carbon dynamics in this ecosystem. So for my presentation today, I'll be focusing mainly on this first objective, just to show you how the role of these demographic processes contributes to net above ground biomass in Nigerian montane forest. So this is a study area in Gelnyaki Forest. Gelnyaki is on the Mambila Plateau. So you find it is part of the Cameroon Highlands, and it is described as a sub-montane dry forest. It is found between 1,400 and 1,700 meters above sea level. It has 1,800 millimeters seasonal annual rainfall. So some of the months from now till November till about April is dry, and the rest of the year is wet. Temperatures can go as low as 13 degrees Celsius, and maximum can be as high as 26 degrees Celsius. Now, this is an area that has lots of interesting species, so it is floristically diverse. It also has lots of faunal diversity, interesting species that are very important for dispersal within the forest. Now, in 2015, we started a Forest Geo plot. Forest Geo means Forest Global Earth Observatory. This is hosted by the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. Forest Geo is based in the US. And the first Forest Geo plot was established in Panama in 1981. And that model of sampling large plots was replicated by different parts of the world, such that now we have about 84 forest geoplots scattered across the globe. In Africa, we have about 6, almost 7 now, because there's a new one underway. And the goal of having these plots is to have, because of the way trees grow, the tree growth is quite slow. It is very difficult to understand changes that happen within a forest ecosystem in such a short time. And so the goal of having a long-term forest plot, which we call the forest geo plot, is such that we can have data for a very long time and we can monitor changes that happen within a forest ecosystem. So one of these plots, we established this 20.28 hectare plot in Ingelnyaki in 2015. And so this is Ingelnyaki forest, and the plot is just this red rectangle over here. That's the position of the plot. And this plot is 20.28 hectares in size. So the plot's design, it's designed to have 507 quadrats, 20 by 20 meter quadrats. And within each of these quadrats, all trees that have a diameter at breast height of 1 centimeter and above was measured and was mapped. And so at the end of 2016, we had recorded 41,031 individuals belonging to 105 morpho species in 87 genera and 47 families. Now, all of these trees, we had marked them at the point we measured their diameter at breast height. And so when we conducted a repeat census for these trees in 2022, we went back to the points where we took the former diameter measurements and we recorded that diameter again. Now, this was for only trees that were alive, because some of these trees had died within the 7-year period. So after conducting the repeat census in 2002, we took these new diameter measurements, and then we also estimated tree heights. And with tree heights, we didn't measure the heights of all the trees. What we did was take a sample of about 400 trees and took their heights, and then we used what we call a Weibull equation to estimate the height for all the other trees within the plot. And so we needed these tree heights and diameter measurements so that we're able to use that to estimate above ground biomass. Now, with above ground biomass, several studies have been done, and there are several equations that have been proposed to be able to that we can use to estimate this above ground biomass. And equation, you need the tree diameter, which we measured, the tree height, which we measured, and then you need wood density. Now, wood density is a feature that is very important in forestry and in ecology, because you use that to look at tree longevity, and it's an indication that can tell you about how a tree is able to survive and is able to withstand certain factors within its environment. So it's expected that a tree that has a high wood density is more resistant to disease or is more resistant to herbivory and so things like that. So with wood density, it's a destructive sampling technique. Now we do not want to cut our trees, so but studies have been done in tropical forests around the world where they've been able to estimate this wood density, and it is kept in a database. And so we retrieved wood density for the species that we have within our plot so that we can use to estimate the above ground biomass for this study. So this is the equation for measuring tree level above ground biomass. Now, this equation is used because for our forest, we assume, or because we see that it looks relatively intact, it doesn't have any major disturbances. There are other equations that have factored in a function for disturbance, and that can be used for areas that have some measure of disturbance that a scientist has been able to estimate. So after we estimated above ground biomass, now for this above ground biomass, for every individual in our census, so for all of those 41,000 trees, and the new trees that we also measured in 2022 because we had new recruits, we estimated above ground biomass for every of those individuals. Now you may ask, okay, what about the trees that died? Okay, so I will explain more on that using the information on this page. So after we estimated above ground biomass, because we're looking at demographic processes, we now looked at how we now estimated growth biomass, recruitment biomass, and mortality biomass. Now this is because we wanted to find out, okay, what is the biomass from surviving trees from the initial census? Remember, I said that in our initial census, which was in 2015, we had 41,000 trees. Between the 7 years, some of the trees died, but some of the trees survived, and so some of these trees grew. So we wanted to know how much biomass they gained from 2015. So we estimated that by subtracting the biomass of that tree at 2015 from the biomass that we calculated for 2022. Then for recruitment biomass, now these are newly recruited trees. Remember, they were not in our population or in our community in 2015. They've only appeared in 2022. So we assumed that their biomass in 2015 was 0 because we did not include them in our records. And so we only took their biomass in 2022 because these are the species that were newly recruited into the plot. Then for mortality biomass, now these trees are dead. We took their biomass in 2015. Currently, their biomass is 0. So we would subtract the biomass as at now, which is 0, from the initial biomass we got in 2015. So from this growth biomass, recruitment biomass, and mortality biomass, we use this to calculate biomass gained. And this biomass gained is simply growth biomass plus recruitment biomass, and we divide it by the plot area, which is the 20.28 hectares. So that is biomass that has come into the area. Then biomass lost is the mortality biomass divided by the plot area. And so biomass gained minus biomass lost will give us net biomass change. Now, this net biomass change would give you an indication if this forest is serving as a carbon sink or a carbon source. So what were our findings? So just to give you a sort of description of what happened within the 7 years. So in what we found in 2022 is that 35,388 individuals out of the 41,000 we had recorded were still alive. So it means 4,973 trees were confirmed dead. 670 trees we recorded as missing. When we say missing, it means that maybe they were broken or uprooted and we could not find the remains. So only the trees that we confirmed dead are trees that we can see it standing and we can see that there's no more growth and there's no living matter. And then we confirm that dead. But there are trees that would just be uprooted or get broken and we could not find them. So we recorded them as missing. So we had 670 of those. And then we had 11,144 new recruits. So what we had found as new individuals that we included in our community when we were sampling was 11,144 new recruits. So from our calculations, we had growth biomass for the plot was 45.41 megagrams per hectare. Recruitment biomass was so small. It was at 1.86 megagrams per hectare, and mortality biomass was 26.93 megagrams per hectare. So our net biomass change was 20.15 megagrams per hectare. And as you can see from these numbers, growth and mortality are the most significant contributors to biomass change, which is as it should be. That's normally the pattern for many studies that have looked at this sort of thing. So just to show you in graphs what it looks like. So if you, on the y-axis is net biomass change, and on the x-axis is either growth biomass, mortality biomass, and recruitment biomass. So the relationship between net biomass with growth, recruitment, and mortality is shown here. So you can see that with growth biomass, the contribution to net biomass change, you can see that it's a positive relationship. So the correlation is a positive 1. With higher growth biomass, there's higher net biomass change. And with mortality, it's the reverse. With recruitment, it's not so clear. And that is why, like I said, growth and mortality make the most significant contribution to net biomass change. Now, the idea is to further investigate what are the contributors to things like mortality, because growth and mortality varies across species. So as you would see in my slides going forward, I'll show you differences across the plot, and I'll also show you differences across species. So this is what this is the plot I had shown you earlier. So with the Nganyaki plot, you can see there's lots of variation. So the plot's dimension is 780 meters by 260 meters. So we calculated for every quadrat the biomass distribution. So you can see that the gray boxes, do not pay attention to them. So in these gray boxes, no data was captured, and that's because most of these areas are grassland, and so we do not have any trees in there, so there's no measurement. So just do not pay attention to the gray boxes. But if you look at it, you would see that growth areas that are very green had higher growth. You have like this quadrant up here. And then you can have areas that are showing negative growth. Now, somebody would ask, do we have negative growth? No, we do not have negative growth. So with species like this, something may have happened to the stem in that area. So you may have that a large tree may have fallen and tampered with some of the stems in this quadrat. And so when you come to remeasure that stem, you're having more of like a negative growth. So normally we do not pay attention to that, or we just remove this from our data. But I just wanted to show you some of the things that we encounter in the field. So with growth biomass, lots of variability within the plot. Some plots, there was hardly any growth, to show you that also for trees, they do not grow as fast as, say, your grasses. Sometimes a tree will remain unchanged under the forest canopy because the conditions are not favorable. And then there is so much competition that happens amongst these trees. And so growth is not usually as fast as you would think that it happens in these ecosystems. Areas that you have high growth, there probably was a sudden opening within the canopy. And so you'd find that trees that used to be small statured suddenly have more light, and then they begin to experience very rapid growth, and they grow quite fast and reach the canopy to occupy the space that has been created. So also with recruitment, recruitment wasn't so much, but it's important to note that areas that you have very high recruitment, there could have also been a tree fall, and then spaces open up in the canopy. You have canopy gaps, and so you'd have many recruits coming up and meeting up the DBH for us to include in our study. Mortality also is driven by several factors, and you can see from here that there were variations in all of these demographic processes. Now, what are the factors that contribute to this is part of the questions we're answering, or part of the things we're trying to find out. Our second objective by looking at functional traits of different species. What species are present in these quadrats that either have very high biomass, growth biomass, or very high mortality biomass, or very high recruitment biomass, and things like that. So when we look at the net biomass change within the plot, you can see that there is of variation too. So you would find that the same plot where we had very high growth change, and so you have areas that are showing that there wasn't any increase in biomass. Instead, there was a decrease in biomass. So it's just like I was saying in the beginning, when we think about how forests store carbon, there are lots of factors that play a part in how forests are able to sequester carbon. Now, this looks, I'm sorry, it looks a bit tiny, but this is a contribution of the demographic processes to biomass gain and loss across species. Now, if you take a look at this, you would see these different species, there is so much variation in how much biomass has been gained or how much biomass has been lost by a species. So if you take, for instance, I'll pick out this this particular species here. This species is called Antonota noldia. Antonota noldia is an edge species in Ngelnyaki. It belongs to the family Fabaceae, and you find it along the edge. It's a canopy tree, and it grows really big. And so you have that it did have very high growth, but it also had high mortality. Okay, but the growth was higher than mortality. So definitely Antonota noldia contributes a high amount of biomass to the ecosystem. So species like Antonota, species like Isolona, species like Strombosia, these are species that they play a very significant role. You find them, they are quite abundant. But apart from being abundant, because our most abundant species, which is Garcinia smithmani, okay, is an understory tree. It doesn't grow so big. You always find it in the canopy. It has over 11,000 individuals in that 41,000. Yet you can see that its contribution to net biomass in this forest is quite small. So abundance may play a role, but abundance is not the most important factor in biomass change within the ecosystem. What plays a more significant role is how big a tree is. So because when biomass is estimated as the dry weight, okay, the definition for biomass is dry weight of a species. So how much space or how much biomass an organism has tells us how much space it is occupying within the ecosystem. And so you find that there is a correlation between biomass and things like basal area for trees. So higher basal area means higher biomass, and larger trees contribute much more to biomass, above ground biomass, than smaller species, even though they are abundant. So the blue is recruitment. So like I said, we didn't have so much recruitment, but you can see growth, mortality, like I mentioned before, are the most significant factors contributing to net biomass within this ecosystem. So this is just like I said, net biomass change by species. So you have Antonota contributes more to the net biomass within this ecosystem. Okay, so like I said, Antonota has the highest net biomass. We also recorded that it has the highest basal area in our initial census. And studies have shown that initial biomass of surviving trees results in higher growth rates. And so species that have higher initial biomass would have higher growth rates across the years. So what are the conclusions from this study? So what we found from our study is that the mean plots above ground biomass and consequently the above ground carbon stock is about 164.16 megagrams of carbon per hectare. This is comparable to what you find in the lowlands, lowland tropical forests, which highlights how important this forest is. Remember when I told you that in that study done by Kuni Sanchez et al., they said that Afro-Montane forest holds carbon stocks of 145 megagrams of carbon per hectare. So what we found for our study is that our plots even holds even much more. I've also mentioned that growth and mortality make a significant contribution to the net biomass carbon. So quantifying carbon stocks is critical if we want to estimate carbon loss through deforestation and forest degradation. And I would like to say that we need to increase our efforts to conserve and restore the remaining forest. Planting forests is important. Many African nations have committed to the Bond Challenge. The Bond Challenge, Nigeria has committed 4 million hectares to plant trees before 2020. 2020 has passed, but this sort of information is important for restoration activities. What species are able to acquire biomass faster, and what species do not acquire biomass so fast. I've also mentioned how diversity is important for ecosystems. It's not just about carbon storage, but also species conservation. They are both important, and you can see that different species play a role in carbon sequestration. So Finally, I'd like to say thank you to all the people that have contributed to making this work a success. I'm very much thankful to my field crew here in Nganyaki. It's a lot of work collecting that amount of data, and they've been so good. Thankful for BES. BES gave me the grants that helped me to do this work, and Forest Geo as well. I also received funding from L'Oreal for Women for Science. And yes, I've received support from the Nigerian Montane Forest Project, University of Canterbury, UJ. Yes, a number of people, Gabriel, Jose, David. And yes, General T.Y. Danjuma was the first person that gave us money to start the plot. And so without his support, we wouldn't have had the Nganyaki Forest Dynamics plots. And yes, to my collaborators, Hazel and David, I want to thank them too. And thank you so very much for listening. I'll take any questions. I hope I have not lost you in the course of the presentation. Thank you.